Thank you for joining tonight for Basic Buddhist Teachings. This morning, I was speaking with Sokuzan as I often do and asking what he'd like me to talk about. And he said, well, why don't you pick another lineage holder, maybe somebody you've not talked about before. And I always get sidetracked. And I don't think Sokuzan minds. I start reading about something and then it connects to something else. And the next thing I know, I'm researching 5 different Zen masters and I'm not really sure what the common thread is. So I actually want to talk about a few teachers tonight, but there was an overarching theme that I encountered today that I personally resonate with and I find helpful, and it's the theme of simplicity. And it's something that I think we all would like things to be simple, but we want them to be simple in kind of a trivial way. Buddhism, from its inception, has been a path of simplicity. And the interesting thing about the Buddha's simplicity is it was a middle path. It wasn't just a path of eliminating, but it was finding the middle way. So simplicity was neither the extreme of asceticism, nor was it the extreme of indulgence. And while to us, the Buddha's lifestyle and the lifestyle of the monastics of early India may seem quite austere, in the context of the time, it really was a middle way. That at this time in India, it's said that one's spiritual prowess was measured by how austere a life you lived, how incredibly or intensely ascetic you practiced, how little you could eat, how little you could sleep, how uncomfortable a place you could find to sit. And the Buddha simplified by finding a middle way. And I don't know if anybody else did this, but when I moved into the monastery, I asked Sokuzan about getting rid of things. And it was almost like, why would you do that? So the simplicity in our mind is how to get rid of things. And his instruction to me at the time was see the relationship you have to the things in your life. And so I would really like to look at this idea of simplicity, not in maybe just the relative sense of keeping our lives simple and clean and tidy, but how we can have a relationship to everything that shows up into our life that's more direct. And there's countless examples of this throughout Buddhism. Almost every teacher has a story about this very topic. And the one I wanted to start with was a really famous Zen master named Shito, also was known by Sekito Kisan. And he's an incredibly important figure in our lineage. He is said to have written the poem Sandokai, or the equality of sameness and difference, which we recite here regularly. And um, as we've talked about, all forms of Buddhism that we call Zen derive from this one teacher, Huineng. Can trace everything back to Huineng. But then there's 2 other teachers that we can trace it back to. There was the Rinzai school, or the Linji school, which can be traced back to a teacher named Matsu. And then there's the Dong school, which became the Soto Zen school, and that can be traced back to Shito. And he wrote this poem called The Song of the Grass Roof Hermitage, less known than Sandokai. And Shito, his name meant something like Rockhead Abbot, that he lived up in the mountains. He spent a great deal of time in seclusion and isolation and was actually almost unknown during his time. And it wasn't until one of his Dharma descendants became very famous, Dongshan Lianji or Tozan Ryokai, that Shito's name became more prominent and his poem Sandokai became more well known. And so I just want to read a few short excerpts. So Shito says, though the hut is small, it includes the entire world. The middling and lowly can't help wondering, will this hut perish or not? Perishable or not, the original master is present, not dwelling south or north, east or west. Thousands of words, myriad interpretations are only to free you from obstructions. If you want to know the undying person in the hut, don't separate from the skin bag here and now. Skin bag is a very common phrase. It sounds silly, but that was a very common reference to the physical incarnate body. And so Shito embodies two forms of simplicity in this poem. He talks about living in seclusion in his grass hut, but he also talks about the simplicity of getting to know oneself right now, the undying nature that this hut may or may not perish, but the master is always present. He had a profound effect on Buddhism going forward. And the next teacher I wanted to share about was a Zen master named Hakuin. All mixed up. And Hakuin expanded on Shito's idea of this grass hut hermitage. And I really liked what Hakuin had to say. And Hakuin is credited with reviving Rinzai Zen in Japan in the 18th century. He was a bit unconventional, a bit outlandish. I know Yudao has spent some time studying him. And what's interesting is he never received Dharma transmission. He was not a transmitted priest, and yet he is one of the most recognizable Rinzai masters in Japan. And so this poem, which showed up probably about 900 years later, much later, references this grass hut hermitage. And Hakuin says, while many of us have pined for the likes of a grass hut hermitage to live and practice in, meditation in the midst of activity and the chaos of urban life has a depth and value more of us are coming to appreciate. Rather than create a dichotomy of mountain, retreat, realization versus city, distractions, compulsion, why not a mind that doesn't create division? Why not a practice that works anywhere? Not that the refreshment of the mountains doesn't have a place for us, but why not create a life that is just enough right where you are? Instead of engaging the mind where everything is never quite right, and we are always seeking for that just right place to train, we can return to the grass hut hermitage within that. We can return to the grass hut hermitage within that is always there for us, not dependent on outside circumstances. Make your upper garments into a monk's robe. Make your chair your sitting cushion. Make the mountains, rivers, and great earth the sitting platform. Make the whole universe your own personal meditation cave. This is the true practice of the sages of the past and of today. Sokuzan talked about the simplicity earlier in the as it is meditation. And this image I really liked. He said you can see it in the middle of sitting on the toilet. And so I had this image of a thatch roofed outhouse. We just had an outhouse built for our retreat center's place at Black Stag. And I think it's just this reminder that we are always searching for an idealized form of practice, an idealized place of practice, an idealized object of practice. We're looking for the grass hut hermitage as an isolated location, and Hakuin encourages us not to ignore the grass hut hermitage of the toilet, the grass hut hermitage of the car, the grass hut hermitage of the kitchen, of the bedroom. So in order to begin to work with this idea of simplicity, it's as we know with everything else, it's not an enactment of simplicity. It's seeing the enticement of the complexity. It's actually trying to solve problems by making them more complicated instead of relating to the nature of things as they arise moment by moment and giving them our attention and seeing very clearly the way in which we relate to our world. We manipulate, we strive. I was reading a lot. I've got so much that's much better than what I have to say. I just got two more. And I thought this one was particularly funny. And this comes from Red Pine. He wrote this book, Road to Heaven. He was searching for hermits in China. And he was going up into the mountains and really having to be his own investigator, trying to track down these people that did not want to be tracked down. They were hermits for a reason. And as he's about to leave China for the last time on this trip, he's in a city and he sees a temple, a sign for a temple that he thought had been destroyed, a very, very famous temple, a Kuan Yin temple. And so he follows the sign and he encounters these monks in the middle of the city and he says to them, I was visiting hermits, and they laughed. One of them said, then you've come to the right place. We're all hermits here. I couldn't help but laugh too. The monk's name was Ju Cheng. He was obviously the abbot, though he denied it. He said he was too dumb to be an abbot. Then he explained that Wolong Temple refused to have an official abbot. He said, if we choose an abbot, he has to be approved by the government. We prefer to be left alone. That's why we don't fix up the temple. The government has offered us money to repair the buildings, but this is a Zen temple. We don't need fancy buildings. Fancy buildings just attract tourists. I smiled and told him this was the first time I had met city hermits. He laughed, and so did I, and then I remembered the Chinese saying, the small hermit lives on a mountain, the great hermit lives in a town. Having nothing left to say, I bowed and said goodbye. Can go on with these stories. They show up in the Kagyu lineage too, where there was this great teacher. He was, I forget his name, he was the abbot of a monastery, and he had a student who had become a yogi living in the mountains, and the abbot made this proclamation that he was a great yogi, and the student got really mad. And it was much later that the student recognized that the meaning of the word is not an artificial expression of practice, but just like these monks in the city, uh, finding a place where they can train their mind without discriminating between the environment that they're in. So before questions, I guess I'd just like to draw this back to why this is applicable to us, and that the practice of meditation is the simplest thing we probably will ever be invited to do. Just like are there any questions? Yeah.
You're divine. You said something about a mind that doesn't create divisions. Is creating anything a division?
I would say relatively yes, but that doesn't mean that things don't arise and fall. The division comes when we seem to solidify the positions, we seem to solidify the subjectivity of it. So I don't think that what's being indicated is that we don't walk through a door to come into this space to practice, or as Sokuzan was talking about, getting very angry or getting very depressed, that those things may arise and fall, but they're not as discrete as we make them out to be. They become very discrete when we attribute them to something. We attribute them to our situation or our mind or just the locality of the body. You know,
when you're bowing, I can't remember which of the masters you said was profound master, but was never transmitted.
Hakuin.
So what is there an advantage of having Dharma transmission?
The advantage of Dharma transmission would be for the benefit of those around you. And as we know, particularly in the Mahayana tradition, there are countless great teachers that were not monastics. And so I think that it's really a matter of what is of benefit to those that you're engaging with. We have a sutra about it. The Vimalakirti Sutra addresses this profound realization in the lay practitioner. So the advantage probably is not so much to the individual receiving the transmission, more so to the needs of those that are around them.
When you're bowing, so in order to become a great teacher, like Hakuin evidently did, was there some transmission that was given to him by those who followed him bowing?
I don't know his story as far as his lineage transmission in a formal sense, like who his teacher was and who then he taught. I feel that, again, the external expression of Dharma transmission, and for me, it functions as a container to help me return. But I think that it's not something that can be relied on. If we rely too heavily on this artificial hierarchy, we become more concerned with being able to continue a lineage of form and image as opposed to a lineage of essence. So in Hakuin's case, I can't speak to him, but it seems that if one sees clearly and they're able to teach that situationally to those around them, that's much more important than any form of sectarianism or hierarchy or tradition that often is grasped at.
You're bowing. So for someone who's fully ordained as a monk in our Soto Zen lineage, is Dharma transmission something to aspire to?
I can't say. Some people would probably certainly aspire to receive that in a formal sense. Somebody may just have the natural inclination to be inspired to teach and continue the lineage, and others may not. So I don't know that a standard can be set up around that. I didn't argue with Sokuzan, but I definitely had some discussions with him and my concerns about him transmitting me. And in the end, his certainty was enough for both of us. That if he, as I've said to people when they say, you know, should I be ordained or should I receive Jukai? And I say, well, what does Sokuzan say? And if he says yes, then, you know, give him the benefit of the doubt and endeavor as best as you can. So I don't know individually how people relate to that. The idealism around teaching will inevitably destroy itself, just the actual situation, the difficulty. And I think it's not just through teaching, but just engaging with Sangha, we really see what we're asking to be a part of, which is the difficulty of our world. Yoka?
Yoka bowing. When we're discriminating and creating stories in the middle of that, what is the simplicity found?
The simplicity to me is not necessarily something, again, that we would recognize, but it's something we can try to talk about. The simplicity is seeing that dependent origination is coming together and that there's nothing that we need to do to modify or interrupt that. And as I said on Wednesday, it doesn't mean inactivity, but it means a great deal of awareness or attention to what is moving. So simplicity in this sense doesn't necessarily arise as a sensation of something feeling very simple, but it may be just a very direct willingness to relate to the situation as it's arising. It doesn't have to be I guess I would just say it that way, just a willingness to relate very directly to whatever's arising, no matter how complicated or complex it appears. Jishin?
Jishin bowing. What is the expression of simplicity in our practice, in the practice which Sokuzan recommends? Bowing.
I appreciate that question because I feel like there's a very simple answer. You say, what is the expression of simplicity? The first expression of simplicity would be the body. That we're doing something a little bit different with the body, but it's quite simple. It's not contortion or acrobatics, and it's situational to each body. The simplicity of sitting in a chair, kneeling in seiza, sitting cross-legged with the hands in the lap or on the knees. It's just something very simple. So there's the first simple expression. We just take an attentive posture. From there, the simplicity of the expression is seeing that what arises in the consciousness of sight, smell, taste, sound, touch, and mind doesn't need to be modified in order for us to practice. So the practice is very simple, and yet what arises in the consciousness may appear very complicated. But that complexity of mind or emotions or feelings doesn't disrupt the simplicity of the intention to be with what arises. So again, we're not talking about simplicity in the way that we're not having anything arising, although we do reduce input by facing the wall. But we're talking about a simplicity of an instruction that just says relate to what shows up. Just look at what shows up.
Thank you.
Shoka, Shoro.
Shoto bowing. Is there a relationship between simplicity and effort? Bowing.
I know the word effort shows up because of the Eightfold Noble Path, or even in the Paramitas as exertion. I resonate with Sokuzan's teaching around intention. And I'm not saying that he would necessarily use those interchangeably, but if we look at simplicity and intention, and I'm deviating from your question a little bit, intention is very simple because it's not based on fruition as it's taught here, that it's just something we return to, so it can have a softness, it can just have a touching that may not be always associated with effort or exertion as we consider it. There's still a lot of exertion on the path, but we also find that some of that energy for that exertion is quite spontaneous. There are times where that's not the case in practice, but a lot of times we find ourselves exerting energy and it being tiring, and yet it's really not a matter of choice.
Shoto bowing. Is there a way simplicity shows up for you on the path, or for you, that you feel inspired to share with someone if they were asking about that or just starting out, like something encouraging?
I think for me, just sharing the practice of Shikantasa. I don't know if we've talked recently, but I don't have a lot to say right now. And my simplicity is being a little bit in the midst of my own not knowing right now, an intense sense of not knowing. And so the lucky thing is I can just continue to return people to Sokuzan. So I don't know, just a greater appreciation of seeing when Sokuzan says you're not that special, that also is a tremendous relief, and that you don't need to modify or fix anyone's situation. You don't even need to encourage them particularly, all the situational you may. Are there further questions this evening?
Sokubowing, the end of Hakuin's, of whatever you read of Hakuin's, felt really inspiring. I'm not going to be able to quote it, but it was about the grass hut of basically everything around you. What is the misunderstanding that sitting on the cushion and facing a wall seems so obviously simpler than than everything off the cushion.
Well, relatively, it is simpler. Meditation, that's really some of the intention with such a strong form, is that we simplify in an intentional way where we reduce stimulation without eliminating it. Looking at the wall reduces input. Having a relatively quiet space reduces input. There's a simple sense of incense, not a lot going on in taste. We are encouraged to work with the body situationally. So it is simpler relatively, and it gives us a chance to begin to look at movement, which is harder to see when we have the body in movement. So we also shouldn't go to the other extreme and say, well, this means that you can do all of your meditation practice while you're walking or driving or cooking. It's probably a good idea to have at least one container where it's very intentional around training the mind.
Was it bowing at the beginning of the talk, you said that Sokuzan had encouraged you to look at your relationship to the things in your life as opposed to
Yes.
get rid of them. Is that where the complexity comes in?
How do you mean?
I'm still, it seems like such a dumb question, but my question really is, what creates the complexity off the cushion?
What creates the complexity off the cushion? I don't think the complexity particularly is creative. There's just a tremendous amount of grasping that we're more likely to be seduced into when the body's in motion. We are much more likely to fall into habituation when our body turns to autopilot. I do this all the time. My body just starts moving, and because of such, I knock a lot of stuff over. I just start moving. There's no thinking, and not in a profound way, like kind of in a artificial ignorance, like a type of ignorance. So the complexity off the cushion is just we tend to fall back into habitual patterns, conditioned relationships to what we're seeing, familiar situations we play our role in, and the meditation practice seems to provide a brief gap where we can look at that, which is otherwise difficult to see. Shoto.
Shoto bowing. Is there a difference in the practice we get out of the space? Like I'm thinking you were bringing up the grass hut that's actually a grass hut and then practicing in the city. Is there a different quality of practice in those situations? Bowing?
Relatively, yes. And Hakuin even says, he says there's still a place for the mountaintop in our practice. So he's not saying that that's a misunderstanding of practice, just as we have now 2 retreat huts for practitioners to go and practice in solitary retreat, or even a monastery for us to come and have concentrated practice. So relatively, yes, there's strong contrasts in what is going to show up when we're isolated. I think a lot of us have found sitting out at the retreat hut Shugyoan is quite pleasant. It's just a nice shift. There's not as much noise. There's green everywhere. There's animals. A nice, comfortable place to sit. So it seems that both are quite valuable. It provides some sort of contrast so we don't become too conditioned in one location, one spot, one form of practice. Go ahead, Jishin.
Ishin bowing. So following what Shodo asked, Hakui said in his poem, "Why not a practice that can be practiced anywhere?" What would be that practice? Bowing.
I think as practitioners, the practice would be shikantaza, and that shows up just in the diversity of places that we practice in this small group, that most of you have spent time in the Zendo, and some of you have sat in your bedroom I've sat in a closet before. You just find a place to sit. Maybe you do find a tree to look at. But that practice is not limited to some idealized isolation of a mountaintop or a thatch roofed hut. So shikantaza, I think also what Shito was pointing at, that whether the hut perishes or not, the master is always present, that what we're endeavoring to look at, we don't have to cross mountains to see, we don't have to, you know, sit somewhere that we've never sat before, that wherever we go, it's right there. I believe that's part of what Shito is pointing at.
Thank you. Dishinbowing. So is there any practice, I don't know whether Hakui recommended any other practice for people who live in the city, in the town, and not necessarily limited to sitting in front of the wall, bowing?
Well, Hakuin was part of the Rinzai lineage, so koan practice was also used heavily. And there's something called a huato. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but a huato would be like a turning phrase. And it would be something that may be a very distilled version of a koan. Like you might just repeat, don't know, don't know, don't know, don't know. Mu. That koan that does a dog have Buddha nature? Mu or empty. So you might just moo, 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 empty, empty, empty. So those would be some of the practices that Hakuin would have also taught, being a part of the Rinzai lineage.
Zuko bowing, are you saying there's less grasping on the cushion than off?
I think that our ability to see the grasping is greater on the cushion initially than off. And again, as I've said, it's very difficult to watch what is arising in the mind when the body's in motion. And the example I give for me is when I'm having any phone conversation, not just difficult ones, it's very uncomfortable. So I pace, I walk about the house, I fiddle with stuff. We're having a hard time, we might go for a walk, we do something with the body. And it's a really simple way we can distract ourselves from our mind. Whereas in the stillness, even if it's only sitting still for a few minutes, moving, sitting still, moving, sitting still, there's something about that that allows us to see the impulses as they arise, or the grasping that's not as clear, it seems, when we're about in our daily lives.
Mozuku bowing. So does seeing the grasping somehow, is that simplicity? Does that?
You could say that.
There's one more.
There was just one more thing I wanted to share this evening. And so Shito expressed the simplicity of environment, and Hakuin, in a sense, expressed the simplicity of environment, which can be found anywhere. But I wanted to read just a brief excerpt from another great Zen master named Huangpo. Huangpo was one of the early lineage holders in China. He was a student of Baicheng and taught Zen master Linji or Rinzai. So again, more in that lineage of Rinzai before Rinzai probably had been born. Linji was probably born, but probably was quite young at this time. So Huangpo is having an exchange with a student. And the student says, if there is no means to reflect it, how can we ever see it? The master said, once you involve means, you necessarily have to include something else. When will that ever end? Don't you see the person talking to you, holding his hands out to give you nothing at all, tiring himself out, insulting you thousands of times? He goes on, and does that person see the reflection is also nothing? The master said, if it is nothing, why is it reflecting you? Don't go around talking in your sleep with your eyes wide open. Knowing 100 different things doesn't compare to not looking for anything. Nothing is more important. A person of the way is someone free of concerns. In truth, there aren't any other kinds of mind or anything else meaningful to talk about. Since we are done, you may as well leave. But there's something really powerful about once you involve means, once you involve a method, once you involve a strategy, you necessarily have to include something else. And so I think that's part of where the power of this early Zen lineage came from, is that they just tried to say this without anything else. Not dissimilar to how Sokuzan teaches, not dissimilar to how we see the teachings arising in the Kagyu lineage or the Nyingma lineage. But there's something very concise about Huangpo says, once you include means, you necessarily have to include something else. And so that's simplicity, that we can sit meditation for meditation's sake. And that may not show up right away, but we can continue to return and acknowledge to ourselves that we're just sitting, we're just sitting, we're just sitting. And we may still have the impulse to look for results, and we may even be able to find something that we can say is fruition or a result of practice, but then we return back to just that gesture of sitting.
Sokubowing, I just want to thank you. You just answered the question I was having trouble asking.
Very good. Thank you. Stand and dedicate the merit.
May the merit of this penetrate into all places, so that we and every sentient being together can realize the Buddha's way. Ji-ho-san shi shi-fu, shi-son-gu-sa-mo-go-sa, SokukoJi. The 10 directions, the 3 times, all Buddhas, all venerable ones, Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, the great Prajna Paramita.
O Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions and the 3 times, please hear us. Please come down out of the light and protect SokukoJi Buddhist Temple Monastery, our Sangha, families, friends, and visitors. Heal everyone who is unhappy, sick, or suffering, and fill them with light.